Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a world of shadows and silences, a place where whispers carried more weight than proclamations, where women walked through life with secrets literally bound to their bodies. Picture yourself on a dimly lit cobblestone street in 19th century America, lanterns swaying overhead, the sound of horse hooves echoing like a slow heartbeat in the distance. You pass a row of tidy wooden houses, lace curtains drawn, and behind those windows lie lives carefully managed, especially when it came to the unmistakable swelling of a woman's belly. Now here's the cheeky reality check. If you lived back then and thought you could casually stroll into town with your pregnancy on display, you probably wouldn't survive the social fallout. Honestly, it makes today's "what will the neighbors think" anxiety look like child's play. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, I'd love it if you dropped your location and local time in the comments. It's always fascinating to see where in the world everyone's listening from, whether you're in Kansas, Kyoto, or curled up at 3 a.m. in Toronto. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself leaning into the first curtain of mystery. Why on earth did women feel they had to hide something as natural, as obvious, and as fundamental as pregnancy? The answer, of course, is tangled up in the threads of culture, religion, fashion, medicine, and fear. In the 19th century, life was full of rules, many of them unspoken but deeply understood. A woman's body wasn't truly her own. It was an emblem of family respectability, of virtue, of self-control. And when the unmistakable sign of sex, pregnancy, showed itself, it wasn't just her secret. It was the families, the husbands, the communities to scrutinize. You imagine a young woman adjusting her shawl tighter around her midsection as she walks into a general store. To you, it's nothing, just another customer. But in that time, every eye followed her posture, her step, her glow or fatigue. People were professional body watchers, reading clues the way we scroll Instagram feeds today. If someone whispered, "she looks different," it could set off an entire network of speculation, like a 19th century version of a viral tweet. Here's a mainstream fact for you. In the Victorian era, modesty was considered a kind of moral armor. Even the word pregnant was avoided in polite society. Newspapers and novels often danced around it with phrases like, "in a delicate condition." Doctors themselves wrote in medical journals with euphemisms that sound more like poetry than science. This avoidance didn't mean people didn't know what was happening. It meant they knew too well, and they preferred to treat it like a shadow, present but never acknowledged. And here's the quirky tidbit. Corsets, which we often imagine as tools of torture, sometimes became allies in concealment. A woman could lace herself into such a rigid silhouette that her swelling belly remained hidden well into the later months. Of course, whether that was remotely healthy is another matter. Historians still argue whether tight lacing during pregnancy was widespread self-deception or merely a rare, desperate choice. Imagine the irony, using fashion designed for vanity to pretend that something profoundly unignorable wasn't happening at all. Think of the tension it created. On one hand, pregnancy was a mark of fulfillment. Married women were expected to produce children, sometimes as many as possible. On the other hand, to actually show the process unfolding was indecent. It was like society wanted the product, but not the production. Imagine if we all celebrated cake, but demanded bakers never be seen cracking eggs. That was 19th century logic for you. You might feel the unease just sitting there in that parlor across from a young wife sipping tea, her movements careful, her hands never straying toward her abdomen. She chats about the weather, about her neighbor's new drapes, about the price of coffee. But in her silence lies the real drama. She is keeping her most important news behind a curtain of calm. Her friends might suspect, might even gossip behind closed doors, but no one dares ask directly. To name it would be a breach of etiquette as shocking as walking into a church shouting swear words. Pregnancy wasn't just a private matter, it was something deliberately hidden until the final weeks or even days when labor forced the truth into the open. You can almost hear the clatter of carriages arriving discreetly at side doors, the muffled cries behind shuttered windows, the sudden arrival of a midwife who pretends she was just passing through. Life's most dramatic transformation, hidden in plain sight. And if you're wondering whether this secrecy ever backfired, oh yes, families sometimes kept pregnancies hidden so long that neighbors were shocked to see a newborn appear without warning, as if conjured out of thin air. And in some tragic cases, the silence made it harder for women to seek help, especially if complications arose. Yet to many, preserving modesty was worth the risk. The whole culture around hidden pregnancies reveals a paradox, a society obsessed with family values but terrified of showing the very process that sustained them. A society that praised mothers but refused to acknowledge the months leading to motherhood. And so women lived in that twilight space, half celebrated, half silenced, walking the cobblestone streets with secrets pressed beneath their bodices, carrying futures while pretending to carry nothing at all. You settle deeper into that imagined parlor, the ticking of a mantel clock, keeping rhythm with the hush of the room. And you notice how much of life in 19th century America was designed to keep things neatly laced away, literally laced in fact. Corsets, those stiff-bodied contraptions of whalebone and tight strings, weren't just symbols of fashion. They were everyday armor, pulled on each morning with the help of another pair of hands, cinched until breathing felt more like a polite suggestion than a biological necessity. Now here's the twist. These same corsets that squeezed women into wasp-waisted ideals also offered a kind of camouflage. Early pregnancy could hide beneath the ridged lines and heavy skirts, giving a woman plausible deniability. To a society that didn't even like to say the word pregnant, this was a win-win. You could be expecting, but to the outside world, you were simply stylish. Think of it as the 19th century version of a photo filter, flattening out inconvenient details. Here's the mainstream fact: corsetry was nearly universal among middle and upper-class women in the early 1800s, and even working-class women often wore looser stays. Doctors and reformers occasionally warned that tight lacing could compress organs, weaken muscles, and even endanger pregnancies. But fashion magazines continued to celebrate the hourglass silhouette. Society valued appearance over comfort, and women were expected to endure the trade-off with grace. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some corsets were actually designed with what were called pregnancy lacings, special side panels that could expand gradually as the months went on. Yes, a maternity corset existed. It's a bit like ordering a cheeseburger and a diet soda in the same meal, a contradiction wrapped in practicality. The idea was that you could both accommodate a growing belly and still keep up the performance of refinement. Whether women really found these comfortable or just a clever marketing ploy remains another matter. And here's where historians still argue: did women actually use corsets deliberately to hide pregnancies, or was that an unintended side effect of daily dress? Some scholars suggest that concealment was more about long skirts, shawls, and social silence, while others believe corsetry was an active tool of disguise. The truth likely lies somewhere in between. Fashion became both a screen and a script, enabling women to walk through crowded streets while carrying a private transformation. You picture the scene: a young woman stepping into church on a Sunday morning. She smooths her skirts, nods politely to a neighbor, and takes her place in the pew. No one sees anything unusual. Her waist looks trim, her posture impeccable. Yet beneath the brocade and linen, her body is shifting, hormones reshaping her very balance, life forming cell by cell. The corset doesn't just cinch, it silences. It creates a socially acceptable facade that keeps the whispers at bay a few weeks longer. But there was risk in this theatre of concealment. Imagine trying to breathe while both pregnant and tightly laced, the pressure against your lungs making each hymn feel like a small act of endurance. Some doctors argued that corsetry could lead to fainting fits, miscarriages, or distorted fetal growth. And yet women wore them anyway because the shame of appearing indelicate was, in their minds, more dangerous than a bit of lightheadedness. You almost want to say, maybe just wear sweatpants instead. But alas, sweatpants hadn't yet been invented. Tragic, really. And don't forget the spectacle of fashion shows in magazines. Engravings displayed women in impossibly narrow-waisted gowns, idealized beyond reality, with nary a sign of swelling belly. These illustrations were like the 19th century Pinterest boards of perfection, silently insisting that real life should imitate the drawing. No wonder so many women clung to corsetry, even when common sense might have begged them to let go. For poorer women, the story played out differently. Stays might be looser, skirts heavier, and concealment more about layers than strict lacing. A working mother on a farm might delay announcing her condition not with a corset, but with sheer distraction, chopping wood, tending animals, bustling about until no one dared question her resilience. Her body became her secret, wrapped not in satin, but in labor itself. Still, the corset has remained one of the most enduring images of pregnancy concealment. It embodied both repression and ingenuity, pain and protection. Women used it to navigate a world that preferred illusions to truths. And as you picture that careful tightening of strings each morning, you can almost hear the quiet sigh of relief when the day ended. The corset loosened, and for a brief moment, the secret belly could breathe again. You picture yourself drifting further down that same parlor hallway, noticing the heavy drapes, the neatly stacked family Bible, the faint scent of lavender water that lingers in the air. Everything around you is arranged to signal propriety, composure, restraint. In 19th century America, modesty wasn't just a preference, it was practically a full-time job. Women weren't merely expected to behave modestly, their very bodies had to appear modest too. And nothing, absolutely nothing, tested that cultural boundary more than pregnancy. The mainstream fact is this: Victorian and antebellum America prized female modesty as the cornerstone of moral society. A woman was seen as the guardian of virtue, the one responsible for upholding not only her own dignity, but also her family's reputation. To display the obvious result of sexual intimacy, even in marriage, was seen as exposing private acts to the public eye, which meant, ironically, that a pregnant body was considered indecent simply for existing. You can imagine the constant calculation. A woman adjusting her shawl, just so, making sure the fold fell across her midsection, or holding a hymn book strategically higher than necessary while singing in church. It was a performance in which the stakes were high, the difference between being seen as respectable or as shamelessly indiscreet. Now, here's the quirky tidbit. Etiquette manuals of the time sometimes gave instructions so comically vague that you'd think they were written by someone terrified of words themselves. One guide suggested that a lady in altered circumstances ought to reduce her social calendar, without ever once naming what those circumstances were. It's the equivalent of your aunt whispering, that thing instead of just saying what she means. These manuals became little instruction books for living a life of elegant omission. Historians still argue whether this culture of modesty created more anxiety than actual scandal. Some believe the rules were so internalized that women policed themselves without needing much outside criticism. while others insist that gossip and watchful neighbours could ruin a reputation in an afternoon. The truth probably lies in a messy middle ground. Women feared both internal shame and external judgment, a double bind that pressed down heavier than any corset. You picture yourself at a genteel tea party, a small group of ladies perched on straight-back chairs, porcelain cups trembling slightly as they lift them to their lips. The talk is of recipes, sewing patterns, and the weather. But under the table, one woman shifts uncomfortably, her growing belly pressing against her stays. She smiles politely, nods at her neighbour's anecdote, and keeps her secret safe. Everyone in the room knows, but no one dares say it. The silence becomes its own form of etiquette. And here's a sly thought for you. In a culture where modesty demanded such secrecy, even husbands sometimes adopted the code. Public acknowledgement of their wives' pregnancies was rare. Men might boast about their children once born, but to comment on the process was considered crude. Imagine your spouse today refusing to talk about your pregnancy at all until the baby arrives. It's absurd, and yet it was simply the done thing. The rules extended even into art and literature. Portraits rarely showed pregnant women except in the most subtle hints, like a strategically draped shawl or a slightly rounded silhouette behind layers of fabric. In novels, writers used euphemisms that sound more like medical mystery stories than plain description. She was confined, or in delicate health. Pregnancy became a ghostly presence in culture, acknowledged only by absence. And so modesty shaped the very rhythm of daily life. Women withdrew from social activities as their pregnancies advanced, not because they were physically incapable, but because showing themselves was considered improper. They vanished quietly into domestic interiors, re-emerging only when the child was born and the body once again fit into society's narrow mold of acceptability. It's strange, isn't it? A world so deeply concerned with morality that it managed to turn one of life's most natural processes into a shameful secret. You can almost hear the quiet sighs of women as they retreated from parlours and promenades, fading from view not because they wanted to, but because culture demanded their disappearance. You lean further into the hush of that parlour world, following the threads of silence that bound women together. If the public gaze forced them to hide, then their relief came in private, through what you might call whisper networks. Pregnancy news travelled not by formal announcement, but by murmurs, side glances, and coded language. Imagine living in a society where something as life-altering as expecting a child was delivered not with balloons and baby showers, but with delicate hints, passed like secret notes in school. The mainstream fact is this. In 19th century America, pregnancy was rarely spoken of directly outside close family circles. Instead, women relied on a network of female friends, sisters, cousins, and neighbors to share the truth. Letters might contain a careful phrase like, "She is feeling unwell but in hopeful spirits," which readers understood as shorthand for, "A baby is on the way." These euphemisms allowed women to communicate without ever breaking the rules of propriety. Here's the quirky tidbit. In some small towns, the language got so coded that outsiders might have thought people were talking about the weather or crop cycles. A neighbour might lean in at a quilting bee and whisper, "She won't be helping with the harvest this year," which everyone knew didn't mean laziness. It meant she was expecting. It's like a secret club where everyone understands the password, except the password keeps changing with every social circle, and historians still argue whether these whisper networks empowered women or kept them trapped. On the one hand, the coded communication gave women control. They could decide who to tell, when to tell, and how much to reveal. On the other hand, the secrecy reinforced the idea that pregnancy was shameful, something unworthy of open discussion. Was this solidarity, or was it complicity? Scholars continue to debate whether these whispers were a form of resistance or a symptom of repression. Picture the scene. A group of women gathered in a kitchen, flour dust hanging in the air, pies cooling on the windowsill. They laugh, trade recipes, and in between comments about spice measurements, someone lowers her voice. "She won't be joining us at church choir for a while." Eyes flicker knowingly, smiles curl discreetly, and the subject is dropped. Everyone understands, but no one speaks further. The silence is as thick as the smell of cinnamon in the room. And of course, gossip was the fuel that kept these networks humming. Once a secret was out, even partially, it could travel faster than any official notice. You might think of it as the 19th century version of social media, except instead of hashtags, people used raised eyebrows and carefully timed pauses. A woman could wake up one morning believing her condition was hidden, and by evening, half the town might already be in the know. There's an almost comical aspect here. Imagine an entire community playing a never-ending game of charades where the answer is always the same: pregnancy, but no one dares to say it out loud. You picture two women walking together, skirts brushing the dusty road. One leans in, whispers, and both giggle softly, covering their mouths with lace gloves. To passers-by, it looks like idle chatter. To them, it's news of new life, safely tucked away in layers of secrecy. Yet beneath the humour lies the weight of consequence. For unmarried women especially, whispers could turn dangerous. What began as a private confidence could easily shift into malicious gossip, with reputations shredded by rumour alone. Families guarded secrets fiercely, not just for modesty, but for survival in a society where being exposed could mean social exile. And still the whisper networks persisted because women needed one another. They shared remedies for nausea, advice for hiding early signs, and strategies for navigating judgmental eyes. In the absence of public acknowledgement, these private channels became lifelines, silent, coded, but strong. So as you drift deeper into the 19th century landscape, you can almost hear those hushed voices circling through parlours and kitchens, carrying secrets wrapped in half-phrases, a world where the truth was spoken only in fragments, and where every whisper mattered. You find yourself walking down a narrow 19th century street, brick shop fronts looming on either side, the smell of coal smoke clinging to your coat. Everything looks perfectly ordinary, children darting between wagons, men tipping hats. But under the surface, scandal is always a few breaths away. And in this century, nothing ignited it faster than the suspicion that a woman was showing too soon. Even married women, those who had followed every rule of church and society, risked shame if their pregnancies became visible before the timing felt appropriate. The mainstream fact here: many communities, both urban and rural, clung to strict expectations about when it was acceptable to appear pregnant after marriage. If a woman began to show within just a few months of her wedding, neighbours might whisper that the child had been conceived out of wedlock. The math mattered. Counting months on fingers became a social sport. Respectability hinged not just on being married, but on the public perception that everything unfolded according to the unwritten calendar. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some couples actually scheduled their weddings around pregnancies, rushing ceremonies forward or moving them back to make the timeline appear respectable. There are surviving diaries that hint at hurried nuptials with lines like, "We felt it wise to marry before autumn," which historians often interpret as code for concealing an early pregnancy. It's the 19th century version of rearranging the furniture when guests are coming over. You're not solving the problem, you're just hiding the mess. And here's the debate that keeps historians busy. Did people truly believe every rumour, or did communities just enjoy the thrill of scandal? Some argue that accusations of impropriety could destroy families, leading to lost business, broken social ties, and even cancelled marriage prospects for younger siblings. Others suggest that most people winked knowingly and carried on, treating it as idle entertainment rather than real condemnation. The truth likely varied. Some towns were merciless, others more forgiving. Picture the scene in a general store, barrels of flour stacked high, glass jars of penny candy lining the shelves. A young woman enters, cheeks flushed, hands folded neatly over her shawl. The shopkeeper greets her warmly, but behind her back 2 matrons in bonnets exchange the kind of look that needs no words. Later, by lamplight, those same matrons will murmur to their husbands about suspicious timing. The woman herself might sense the scrutiny, every glance weighing heavier than the bundles she carries home. And if you think that sounds exhausting, you're right. Women lived in constant awareness that their bodies were being measured against invisible rules. A cough could be dismissed, but a slightly fuller waistline could spark days of chatter. Even married women with multiple children sometimes tried to hide subsequent pregnancies, weary of becoming a topic of speculation yet again. Imagine never being able to simply say, "Yes, I'm expecting," without it spiraling into a calculation game for the entire neighborhood. Sometimes women leaned into humor as quiet resistance. There are anecdotes of wives joking privately with friends, "If they must count, I hope they can at least do it correctly," turning the scrutiny into a source of laughter. Humor softened the sting, but only behind closed doors. Publicly, the performance of silence remained intact. And the risk wasn't just gossip. In certain circles, early visibility could actually affect a husband's career. Politicians, clergymen, and businessmen all relied heavily on appearing morally upright. A wife who showed too soon could tarnish her husband's credibility. The burden of respectability weighed unevenly, pressing hardest on women, but reaching outward to everyone connected to them. So, as you picture those cobblestones and lamplights again, imagine the weight of secrecy woven into each woman's walk. Hiding wasn't just about modesty, it was about survival in a society eager to pounce on the faintest whiff of scandal. Women carried not only children but reputations balanced precariously under their shawls, corsets, and carefully timed smiles. You let your mind wander into the dimly lit examination room of a 19th century doctor's office, its wooden shelves stacked with thick, leather-bound books, jars of dubious tonics, and maybe a skull or two for study. The air smells faintly of laudanum and dust. A nervous woman sits stiffly in a chair while the physician, waistcoat straining against his middle, fumbles through what little he actually knows about pregnancy. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Medicine in that era wasn't exactly a shining beacon of clarity when it came to women's health. The mainstream fact is this: medical science in the early 1800s had only a patchy understanding of pregnancy. While some doctors could recognize obvious signs, many struggled to pin down the early months. Quickening, the moment when a woman first felt the baby move, was often used as the main marker of pregnancy, usually around 4 to 5 months in. Before that, doctors hesitated to declare anything with certainty. Missed periods, morning sickness, fatigue. These could all be written off as female troubles, a vague diagnosis that covered everything from indigestion to hysteria. Now here's the quirky tidbit. Some physicians carried a little tool called a probang, basically a long wire used for throat examinations, and they claimed it could somehow help them determine pregnancy by listening to abdominal sounds. Spoiler: it didn't. Others recommended pressing an ear directly against the belly, an early, awkward version of the stethoscope. You can picture a stern-faced doctor crouched beside a patient, ear pressed against her corset, trying to look serious while probably just hearing stomach gurgles. Not exactly the most scientific method, and historians still argue whether women trusted doctors at all in this matter. Midwives, with their centuries of practical knowledge, often inspired more confidence than physicians with their Latin jargon and dubious instruments. Some scholars suggest women deliberately avoided doctors until late in pregnancy, preferring to keep things private and within the female network. Others argue that by mid-century, the rising authority of man midwives was already reshaping trust, even if reluctantly. The truth is slippery. Like many secrets of that era, it depended on class, location, and personal circumstance. Imagine the anxiety this created. A woman might suspect she was pregnant, but receive no firm confirmation from her doctor for months. That uncertainty gave her plausible deniability, helpful if she wanted to hide her condition. "The doctor isn't sure yet," she could say, buying herself more time behind a veil of ambiguity. At the same time, the lack of clarity put her health at risk. Without prenatal care, she faced the possibility of complications catching her unprepared. And remember, doctors themselves often reinforced modesty norms. They avoided blunt language, opting for euphemisms in both conversation and writing. A medical journal might refer to pregnancy as a peculiar state or uterine fulfillment, phrases that sound like rejected poetry drafts. Reading these descriptions today, you can almost hear the physicians tiptoeing around the reality, terrified of offending their own colleagues. Picture a young wife leaving such an appointment, bonnet tied tightly, gloves buttoned. The doctor hadn't confirmed anything, but she knew in her body what was happening. Still, she walked out into the street with her secret intact, corset-laced, smile polite. The uncertainty served her. It let her carry on without fear of direct accusation. After all, even the doctor couldn't say for sure. And if you think this medical mystery feels frustrating, you're not alone. Women lived with an odd blend of knowledge and denial, intuition and ambiguity. Their bodies told them the truth, but society, reinforced by medicine, allowed them to keep that truth unspoken until it could no longer be ignored. So, as you picture that doctor's dim office fading into the lamplight outside, you understand why secrecy flourished. Science wasn't ready to illuminate the truth, and society wasn't ready to face it, which left women in a strange in-between, a place where their most important reality was both undeniable and officially unconfirmed. You find yourself easing into the wooden pews of a 19th century church, the scent of beeswax candles lingering in the air, the sound of hymnals rustling as people take their places. The minister steps up to the pulpit, eyes sweeping over the congregation, his voice solemn and steady. He talks about sin, about temptation, about the sacred duties of family life. And though he never says the word pregnancy, you know that every woman in the room feels the weight of his gaze pressing down on her abdomen. The mainstream fact here is this: the church exerted immense influence over daily life in 19th century America. Sermons weren't just religious, they were social guidelines, setting the moral compass for communities. Ministers often spoke in lofty terms about chastity, virtue, and propriety. To be visibly pregnant was to carry proof of sexual intimacy, even within marriage, and that made it an uncomfortable reminder of the flesh in a place that glorified the spirit. Now for the quirky tidbit: some churches actually had designated women's pews, benches set aside for those who were visibly expecting or caring for infants. It sounds considerate, but in practice it often meant those women were quietly segregated, their bodies grouped together like a visual footnote to the sermon. Imagine being politely herded into the delicate condition section, as if pregnancy were a mild contagion, not exactly the most relaxing way to worship. And here's the open scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the Church's emphasis on modesty empowered women by giving them a moral pedestal, or whether it trapped them by demanding they live as symbols rather than individuals. Some see the sermons as elevating women to keepers of virtue, while others point out how this elevation turned into control, women's bodies scrutinized for any slip, any bulge, any betrayal of private life. The line between reverence and repression is blurry, and scholars keep circling around it. You picture a young couple walking home from Sunday service, boots crunching on gravel, the husband carrying the Bible under one arm. He chats about the sermon's message, but his wife remains quiet, pressing her shawl closer across her chest. She knows the women who sat behind them whispered during the hymns, and she knows those whispers will ripple through town by supper time. It isn't the minister's words that haunt her, it's the silent judgment humming through the pews. Religion offered both comfort and pressure. Women turned to faith for strength in the solitude of pregnancy, yet the very same institution sometimes made them feel ashamed for displaying it. The church blessed children but frowned on the visibility of their creation. Imagine being praised for your family while simultaneously being told to cover the evidence that your family was expanding. It's like congratulating a baker on delicious bread, but insisting the dough never be seen rising. In smaller congregations, everyone knew everyone else's timeline. A wedding in March, a baptism by the following December, acceptable. A baptism in September, suspicious. Parish registers became quiet scorecards of virtue, though no one admitted it aloud. A young mother's absence from church as her pregnancy advanced only deepened the speculation. People might murmur, "She is unwell," but everyone knew the code. And yet there were moments of solidarity too. In the back rows, women leaned close, sharing gentle reassurances, exchanging glances that said, "I understand." In those small acts, you glimpse a rebellion of compassion beneath the stern weight of sermons. So, as the church bells toll and the congregation disperses into the cool evening, you realize that religion didn't simply teach faith, it enforced secrecy. The pulpit's silence on the subject echoed louder than words, and women carried that silence home like another layer of clothing, binding them as tightly as any corset ever could. You follow the echoes of those church bells down a dirt lane, past rows of clapboard houses with whitewashed fences, each one standing like a quiet fortress of family honor. In 19th century America, reputation wasn't just about your name, it was your currency, your shield, your ticket to belonging. And nowhere was that reputation more fragile than in the lives of women carrying children. Pregnancy may have been natural, but showing it too boldly risked staining the family name, and that stain could spread like spilled ink across generations. The mainstream fact here, in many communities, a family's social standing was tied directly to the perceived virtue of its women. A daughter or wife who appeared indecent could undermine a father's business prospects, a brother's marriage chances, even the family's standing in church. This is why secrecy around pregnancy wasn't simply personal, it was communal. To guard the belly was to guard the honor of everyone who shared your last name. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some families went to absurd lengths to control appearances. There are accounts of young wives being sent to distant relatives for months, reappearing only after childbirth with a mystery infant that was presented as an adoption or as a child who had simply been in the family all along. Think of it as a 19th century version of the out-of-office email, except instead of an inbox, it was your entire existence being hidden until further notice. And historians still argue about the balance between genuine moral panic and simple reputation management. Were families truly terrified of moral collapse if a pregnancy showed too soon, or were they more afraid of social exclusion, economic disadvantage, and gossip? Some scholars say it was religious fervor that fueled the silence, while others point to the practical realities of status and money. It's likely both, a mix of belief and cold calculation stitched together as tightly as a lace bodice. Picture the household, a stern father at the head of the table, his fork tapping against his plate. He doesn't mention his daughter's altered figure, but his eyes flicker whenever she reaches for bread. The mother, ever watchful, orchestrates her daughter's appearances in public, short visits, careful clothing, strategic absences. Brothers tease one another loudly, but they fall silent when their sister enters the room. The entire family becomes actors in a play of concealment, each gesture rehearsed, each silence calculated. It wasn't just about unmarried daughters, though their situations were certainly the most precarious. Even married women carried the burden of timing. Too many children too quickly could signal a lack of self-control, a failure to manage the household with discipline. On the other hand, too few children raised suspicions of sterility or selfishness. Either way, a woman's body told a story the family wanted to edit, and pregnancy concealment was the red pen. And then there's the social season, those dances, picnics, and holiday gatherings where appearances mattered most. Families sometimes maneuvered carefully around these dates, keeping expectant daughters conveniently ill or traveling during the height of gossip season. You can almost hear the sigh of relief when a pregnancy was successfully hidden until the child's arrival, the honor preserved, the whispers deflected. But not every family succeeded. One slip, a corset loosened too much, a shawl falling aside, a sharp-eyed neighbor catching the swell of a belly at the market, and the game was over. A single whisper could ripple outward, tainting not just the woman, but her entire kin. Families who prided themselves on respectability suddenly found themselves under scrutiny, and climbing back from that social pit could take years. So as you step past those clapboard fences in your imagination, you realize how heavy the burden of secrecy truly was. Women didn't just carry children, they carried the fragile glass globe of family honor, balancing it in silence, terrified of a single crack. You drift now into the uneasy space of courtship, where secrecy took on sharper edges. Imagine being an unmarried woman in 19th century America, her hands folded demurely in her lap, as she sits in a parlor with a suitor. The room smells faintly of beeswax polish and fading roses, the conversation stiff but polite. And yet, behind every glance and every pause lies a truth. If she were suspected of pregnancy without a wedding ring, her entire world could collapse. The mainstream fact is this: for unmarried women, pregnancy was considered the ultimate social catastrophe. In many communities, it marked not just personal shame, but moral failure, stripping away any chance at respectable marriage. Laws themselves often reflected this bias. Some states had bastardy laws that allowed fathers to deny paternity, leaving the mother legally and financially vulnerable. A pregnancy outside wedlock wasn't just frowned upon, it could be life-destroying. Here's the quirky tidbit. Sometimes families staged hurried shotgun weddings, but not always with an actual gun. The term was more metaphorical than literal, though there are scattered tales of stern fathers making their intentions very clear to reluctant suitors. In fact, some families even arranged rushed double weddings, pairing off a pregnant daughter alongside a conveniently available sibling, so the timeline confusion looked more natural. It was part marriage ceremony, part damage control strategy. And historians still argue whether these hurried unions truly saved reputations or only papered over the scandal. Some scholars say the community usually knew the truth anyway, and merely pretended otherwise to preserve appearances. Others suggest that once a ring was on the finger, society was surprisingly forgiving, eager to erase the timeline in exchange for the comfort of respectability. The reality was probably somewhere in the murky middle, a blend of knowing nods, selective blindness, and pragmatic forgiveness. Picture the terror for the woman herself. A missed period, a tightening bodice, a sudden wave of nausea during Sunday service, each moment could spell exposure. She might confide in no one but her closest friend, and even then in hushed tones. If the whispers spread before a plan was made, her life could narrow quickly. No more suitors, no invitations, even friendships fractured under the weight of judgment. And if no marriage materialized, the options were grim. Some young women were sent away to relatives, the baby born in secrecy and given up for adoption, or quietly integrated into another household as a cousin or ward. Others turned to dangerous remedies, herbal concoctions, dubious patent medicines, even physical exertion, to try to end the pregnancy before it showed. These desperate choices often carried high risks, yet desperation left little room for caution. Even those who managed to marry before the baby arrived lived with the lingering anxiety of gossip. A child born too soon after the wedding was the subject of endless arithmetic in the neighborhood. Imagine being welcomed at church with polite smiles, all the while knowing people were silently counting months on their fingers behind their hymnals. It wasn't just embarrassing, it was suffocating. And yet, in all this fear, there were flickers of resilience. Women created their own coded ways of supporting one another, lending shawls or suggesting remedies to ease sickness, covering for absences at social gatherings, spinning little stories that protected their friends. Whisper networks weren't only about spreading scandal, they were also about building shields of silence where solidarity replaced condemnation. So, as you sit in that parlor again, the ticking clock filling the silence between stiff sentences, you feel the crushing weight of stakes that went beyond personal shame. To be visibly pregnant without a husband was to be trapped in a public trial with no defense. And in that world, concealment wasn't vanity, it was survival. You step softly into a dim farmhouse kitchen at dusk, where the fire glows low and the shadows climb the walls. A woman sits at the table, her hands wrapped around a chipped mug of tea. Across from her, another woman, a neighbor perhaps, leans in close, voice lowered. This is no ordinary visit, it is a midwife slipping quietly through the back door, a healer whose presence is as necessary as it is invisible. In a world where pregnancy must remain hidden, midwives became not just caretakers, but conspirators in the art of secrecy. The mainstream fact is this: midwives remained the primary providers of pregnancy and childbirth care in much of 19th century America, especially in rural areas. Though man midwives and doctors were rising in cities, women still relied heavily on these experienced figures who carried not only herbal remedies and birthing skills, but also discretion. A midwife knew how to keep a confidence. She was often a family's first call when signs of pregnancy appeared, and sometimes the only person outside the household who ever acknowledged it openly. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some midwives deliberately disguised their visits as ordinary social calls. They might arrive carrying a basket of bread, a bundle of herbs, or a sewing kit, giving neighbors the impression of a casual errand. Inside, though, they whispered advice about nausea, adjusted corsets for comfort, or passed along recipes for strengthening teas. It was a performance of normalcy, a masquerade that kept suspicion at bay. Think of it as the 19th century version of incognito browsing, only with shawls and sourdough. And here's where historians still argue: did midwives function as protectors of women's autonomy, or as enforcers of the very secrecy that constrained them? Some scholars see them as allies, providing care in a judgmental society. Others argue that midwives reinforced silence by keeping everything in the shadows, preventing open conversation about women's bodies. The truth is likely both. Midwives offered safety, but in doing so they also helped maintain the culture of concealment. Imagine the quiet reassurance they brought. A nervous young wife might whisper her fears as the midwife measured her pulse, offering soothing words and practical advice. "Keep your shawl close," the midwife might murmur, or "rest when you can, but not too much, or people will notice." She was equal parts medical provider and strategist, guiding women through the tightrope walk of secrecy. And the remedies, they were often a mix of tradition and experimentation. Herbal infusions of raspberry leaf or chamomile, poultices for swelling, even whispered charms meant to ease labor pains. Some midwives carried small handwritten recipe books, their pages stained with generations of use, passed down like heirlooms of knowledge. To an outsider, it looked like superstition. To the women who relied on it, it was survival disguised as routine. Picture, too, the role midwives played in gossip control. They knew every family's secrets, but rarely let them slip. In communities where a single rumor could destroy reputations, a midwife's discretion was worth more than gold. If anyone asked about her late-night visits, she might simply shrug and say she'd been called to tend to a headache or to deliver broth to a sick neighbor. Her silence preserved lives and reputations alike. Of course, not every midwife had the same skill or tact. Some grew infamous for being too loose-lipped, while others leaned more toward administering risky remedies to end pregnancies rather than support them. In towns where options were few, women sometimes gambled on whoever was available, knowing full well that trust could be as fragile as lace. And so the midwife became a liminal figure, half healer, half secret keeper, moving quietly between households, carrying whispers in her satchel alongside herbs and bandages. In her presence, women found a rare space where their condition could be spoken of, even if softly. She was both a comfort and a reminder of the silence wrapped around them. So, as you sit in that farmhouse kitchen, listening to the low murmur of voices and the scrape of a chair against worn floorboards, you understand how crucial midwives were, not only for bringing babies safely into the world, but for helping women navigate the perilous line between what was known and what could never be said aloud. You slip now into the pages of a 19th century women's magazine, the kind printed on coarse paper with inky illustrations of gowns, gloves, and hair ribbons. At first glance, it looks like harmless entertainment, recipes for pudding, patterns for embroidery, advice for keeping one's parlour tidy. But as your eyes skim the columns, you realize what isn't there. Pregnancy, that most central experience for so many women, is almost entirely absent, tucked away behind euphemism or ignored altogether. The mainstream fact here is this: popular women's magazines like Godey's Lady's Book carefully avoided direct mention of pregnancy throughout much of the century. They celebrated marriage, motherhood, and domestic virtue, but the physical reality of childbearing remained off the page. When advice appeared, it was couched in vague phrases like maintaining delicate health or ensuring a mother's vigor. It was less information, more performance, keeping readers entertained while leaving their most pressing questions unanswered. Now for the quirky tidbit. Some magazines included fashion plates that subtly served the purpose of pregnancy concealment guides. Wide crinolines, layered shawls, or strategically draped sashes were praised not just for their elegance, but for their graceful coverage. You can almost imagine an editor writing the copy with a sly wink, knowing readers understood the real use. A dress described as ideal for the expectant matron was as close as they came to saying the word. And here's the open scholarly debate. Historians argue whether this silence was a matter of censorship or simply consumer demand. Were editors deliberately dodging scandal to keep advertisers and clergymen happy? Or were middle-class readers themselves uncomfortable with frank discussion? Some scholars suggest women privately longed for more honesty, while others argue the silence reflected their own internalized modesty. The truth probably shifts depending on whose parlour you imagine, the genteel drawing rooms of Boston versus the rough farmhouses of Ohio. Picture the scene: a young woman leafing through the latest issue, the paper crackling under her fingers, as she admires an illustration of a tea gown. She lingers on a page about managing one's constitution, where the prose dances around digestion, fatigue, and delicate adjustments of health. She nods, reading between the lines, because she knows her own body is changing, but the magazine refuses to name it. Her mother might give her a knowing look, but no one will explain further. Knowledge remains a patchwork of whispers, never fully stitched together in print. The absence wasn't just in magazines. Household guides, etiquette manuals, and even cookbooks often carried pages upon pages of advice for wives and mothers while skipping over the months before a child arrived. It's as if society wanted motherhood without admitting how one became a mother. Imagine reading a storybook where the plot skips from once upon a time to happily ever after, leaving the middle chapters blank. That's how pregnancy lived in the printed word. Of course, readers weren't fools. They recognized the gaps and sometimes filled them with satire. There are surviving letters to editors in which women half-jokingly asked for recipes to cure one's delicate conditions, or patterns suitable for the rotund matron. The editors usually ignored them, but the humor revealed a quiet awareness of the absurdity. Everyone knew what was missing. No one dared print it. The effect of this silence was profound. It kept pregnancy in the realm of the private, reinforcing the idea that to speak of it was improper. At the same time, it fueled the whisper networks and midwives' importance, because where the page refused to teach, women turned to one another. The absence itself became a kind of presence, shaping culture not by what it said, but by what it refused to say. So as you close that ink-stained magazine and set it aside on the parlor table, you hear the hush between its lines, louder than its words. It is the silence of a society determined to celebrate motherhood, but erase the path that led there, leaving women to navigate their most transformative journeys alone, hidden, and unnamed. You turn now from those ink-stained magazines to the voices that filled parlors, kitchens, and letters. Euphemisms, the art of saying without saying. In 19th century America, language itself became a veil, carefully draped to conceal the obvious. When pregnancy had to be acknowledged, it was rarely named outright. Instead, it was softened, sidestepped, and disguised in phrases so vague they could mean almost anything. The mainstream fact here is this: the phrase "in a delicate condition" was the most common way to refer to pregnancy in polite society. It was a kind of verbal corset, shaping the truth into something slim enough to pass through drawing-room conversations without offense. Other phrases included "in a family way," "expecting," or "confined." Even doctors in their records often chose these words, reinforcing the silence with medical authority. Now for the quirky tidbit, some families went so far with euphemism that they created their own private codes. One diary from the 1840s notes a daughter being indisposed for social call, which the family clearly understood as pregnant. In another case, a mother wrote that her daughter was growing roses indoors. A poetic but bewildering phrase unless you knew the context. It's almost as if pregnancy became a literary genre of its own, each household inventing creative ways to tiptoe around it. And historians still argue whether this linguistic dance was liberating or oppressive. On one hand, euphemisms allowed people to acknowledge pregnancy without shattering social norms, providing a kind of safe middle ground. On the other, they kept women's bodies shrouded in shame, implying that even the word pregnant was too indecent to speak. Was it kindness or was it censorship? Scholars debate whether these phrases softened reality or silenced it further. Picture the parlor, a circle of women sipping tea, skirts rustling as they shift in their chairs. One leans toward another and whispers, "Did you hear? Mrs. Palmer is in a delicate condition." A polite smile, a nod, and the subject is dropped. No one asks when she's due, No one jokes about baby names. The room falls briefly into a hush, as if a ghost had brushed past. The phrase had spoken volumes while saying almost nothing. Even in literature, the code persisted. Novels might hint that a character withdrew from society for reasons of health, or that she was confined to her chambers. Readers knew exactly what it meant, yet the author maintained the veneer of decorum. Imagine watching a play where the main actor leaves the stage for half an hour and the script simply tells you something important happened backstage. That was pregnancy in fiction. This coded language also extended to the workplace, or what passed for women's work. Employers might quietly dismiss a maid by saying she had taken on family obligations. Neighbours might say a seamstress was not presently available. These phrases made absence palatable, but they also erased the reality of women's physical labour, as if it were too vulgar to mention. Yet for all its absurdity, euphemism sometimes gave women cover. To say one was delicate offered a socially acceptable excuse to withdraw from events, avoid certain duties, or explain sudden fatigue. It became both shield and shackle, protecting women from direct confrontation, but also binding them to silence. So as you wander through those parlours in your imagination, you can almost hear the hush of coded words floating in the air. Delicate, confined, indisposed. They're like faded ink on a letter, soft, smudged, never direct. And in those silences, the reality of pregnancy slipped by unseen, hidden not just beneath corsets and shawls, but beneath the very words people chose to speak. You step into a narrow pantry, the shelves lined with jars of pickles and dried beans, the air faint with vinegar and smoke from the kitchen hearth. A woman stands there, turning a small bottle of liquid in her hand, the glass glinting in the lamplight. She hesitates, glances at the door to make sure it's closed, and then slips the bottle back into the shadows. These were the dangerous remedies of the 19th century, folk tricks, patent medicines, and whispered recipes passed between women who were desperate to control how visible their pregnancies became. The mainstream fact here is this: the 19th century was flooded with patent medicines, cheap, widely advertised concoctions promising cures for female irregularities. Many of these remedies contained alcohol, opium, or other powerful ingredients. While some were marketed as treatments for menstrual problems, women often used them as abortifacients, or at least as ways to delay or obscure signs of pregnancy. Doctors publicly condemned their use, but the bottles kept selling by the thousands. Now, for the quirky tidbit, one infamous ingredient was ergot, a fungus that grows on rye. In small doses, it could cause uterine contractions. In larger doses, it could kill. Despite the danger, ergot-based teas and tinctures circulated quietly in kitchens, midwives' baskets, and back rooms. Women brewed them in secrecy, hoping to restore their courses without alerting husbands or neighbours. Imagine sipping a tea that could either solve your problem or make you violently ill, all while pretending it was just another evening ritual. And here's the open scholarly debate. Historians disagree about how widespread these practices were. Some argue that most women relied on natural concealment, clothing, euphemisms and silence, resorting to remedies only rarely. Others believe that abortifacients and folk concoctions were a common, if hidden, part of women's reproductive lives. Because so much happened off the record, in whispers and shadows, we may never know the true scale. The absence of documentation is itself part of the secrecy. Picture the scene again. A midwife handing over a packet of herbs with careful instructions. Boil only a handful. Take no more than a sip. The woman tucks it into her apron pocket, heart pounding. Later, as her family eats supper, she excuses herself, slipping away to the pantry where she prepares the brew. She drinks quickly, the taste bitter, the outcome uncertain. She returns to the table smiling faintly, her secret locked behind clenched teeth. Other remedies were less about ending pregnancies and more about disguising them. Some women bound their bellies tightly, not just with corsets, but with homemade wraps. Others wore extra petticoats to even out their silhouettes, creating the illusion of simple bulk rather than rounded growth. Even diets came into play, avoiding foods that caused bloating or sipping vinegar water in hopes of reducing appetite. These practices carried risks, but so did exposure, and the folk remedies weren't limited to herbs. Some women believed strenuous exercise, long walks, horseback riding, or even deliberate falls could solve the problem. There are heartbreaking accounts of women hurling themselves against furniture or carrying heavy loads far beyond safety, driven by desperation. Each bruise or ache became another silent secret, hidden beneath shawls and polite smiles. All of it underscores how secrecy and danger were intertwined. The less society allowed open conversation, the more women turned to dangerous, improvised methods. Silence was not protection, it was peril, tucked into bottles and whispered into kitchens. So as you stand in that dim pantry of your imagination, listening to the clink of glass bottles and the whisper of dried herbs being measured into cups, you realize that concealment wasn't only about corsets or coded words. Sometimes it was brewed, swallowed, endured. Quiet experiments with remedies that could either preserve secrecy or end a life. And women, caught in the bind of modesty and fear, often had no choice but to gamble in the shadows. You step out of the dim pantry and into the rhythm of the broader household, where calendars marked not only harvests and holidays, but also secrets. In 19th century America, the timing of a pregnancy wasn't just biology, it was social strategy. Women and families learned to navigate seasons, events, and gatherings with the precision of generals plotting a campaign. Concealment meant thinking months ahead, sometimes years, planning how and when a swelling belly might overlap with the community's watchful gaze. The mainstream fact is this: many women planned their public appearances around both the seasons and the social calendar. In summer, with lighter dresses and thinner fabrics, hiding was more difficult, so some women avoided travel or gatherings during those months. Winter, by contrast, was a time of heavy cloaks and layers, perfect for disguising a pregnancy beneath wool and fur. It was no accident that many births clustered at particular times of year. Couples were attuned to when pregnancy would be easiest to keep out of sight. Now, for the quirky tidbit, some etiquette guides even suggested that expectant mothers should retire from social life during the later months, especially around holidays like Christmas or Easter, when gatherings were large and attention sharper. Imagine the absurdity of disappearing right before the family feast, only to reappear later with a newborn. It's the 19th century equivalent of skipping Thanksgiving and showing up at New Year's with a +1 who happens to be 3 weeks old. And here's the open scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether this careful timing was an intentional family strategy or simply a coincidence of rural life and seasonal cycles. Some believe women and their families deliberately planned pregnancies to align with periods of easier concealment, while others argue that childbirth's natural unpredictability made such planning more aspiration than reality. The truth likely varied. Wealthier families could afford to plan more, while poorer families simply adapted as best they could. Picture a small town in autumn, the air crisp, leaves crunching underfoot, church bells ringing out for the harvest festival. Families gather in the square, stalls piled with pumpkins and apples, but one household is missing. Their daughter, who usually helps with the pie table, is indisposed this year. Neighbors note her absence, exchange glances, and tuck the observation away like a mental note in a ledger. The family hopes the timing of the season will pass before the whispers catch up. Even weddings and funerals became stages for concealment. To show up visibly pregnant at someone else's wedding was considered not only improper but overshadowing, stealing attention from the bride. So, families often kept expectant women at home, claiming illness or fatigue. Funerals carried their own pressures, where attendance was both a duty and a display of family solidarity. Imagine the difficulty of balancing grief with the need to hide a secret swelling beneath black crepe dresses. And then there were holidays. Christmas was a time of large gatherings when every relative's eye might wander toward a young wife. Easter, with its lighter fabrics and pastel gowns, brought similar scrutiny. Many women disappeared from society during these periods, reappearing only once the child was safely born and the scandal neatly avoided. It wasn't just social gatherings, community events like fairs, barn raisings and town meetings all provided opportunities for gossip. Families carefully selected who attended and when, crafting alibis as skillfully as they crafted quilts. Sometimes an entire household adjusted its schedule to protect one member's secret. So, as you imagine the ticking of the family clock on the mantel, each day marked off with silent calculation, you feel the weight of time as more than hours. For these women, the calendar wasn't simply a record of days, it was a battlefield of strategy, where pregnancy had to be hidden beneath the folds of seasons, holidays, and the endless scrutiny of society's watchful eyes. You picture yourself on a rutted dirt road, wheels of a carriage creaking as it sways from side to side. The horses snort clouds of breath into the cool air, and inside the carriage a woman sits upright, one hand clutching her parasol, the other adjusting the folds of her gown. Travel in the 19th century wasn't simply about getting from place to place, it was also an opportunity for performance, for disguise. For women in delicate condition, a trip could serve as both cover story and concealment strategy. The mainstream fact is this: carriages, trains, and later even steamboats provided more than transportation. They offered women a way to step out of their immediate community's gaze. A woman who disappeared for a few weeks or months might return with a new ward, or with vague explanations of illness cured by fresh country air. Travel was often used as a socially acceptable excuse to vanish when concealment became impossible. Here's the quirky tidbit: parasols, those dainty accessories we usually imagine as sun shields, sometimes doubled as distraction devices. Women learned to angle them not only against glare, but also across their bodies, using them like polite shields in public. Add to that the wide shawls, the heavy reticules, purses, and the art of folding oneself neatly into carriage corners, and you get a travelling toolkit of camouflage. It's almost comical, like watching a magician's act where scarves keep appearing until the truth underneath is hidden completely. And here's where historians still argue: were these concealment strategies deliberate acts of resistance, or simply instinctive performances of modesty? Some scholars argue that women intentionally weaponized fashion and travel as tools of agency, while others suggest they were merely following unspoken rules without consciously resisting them. Either way, the result was the same: a moving stage where women played roles of normalcy while carrying profound secrets. Picture a crowded railway station in the 1850s, steam hissing from the engine, porters calling out destinations. A young woman boards, gloved hand gripping the railing, her family waving discreetly from the platform. Neighbours may whisper, "She's gone to visit cousins," but the truth is that her belly has grown too visible for Sunday services back home. On the train, surrounded by strangers, she breathes easier. No one here is counting months or glancing suspiciously at her figure. Travel offers a brief anonymity, a chance to exist without the constant scrutiny of familiar eyes. Of course, not every journey was escape. Some outings were carefully staged to prove normalcy. A woman might insist on riding in a carriage through town, shawl tucked tightly around her, projecting an image of ordinary life. The bumps of the road, the rhythm of hooves, even the chatter of passers-by, all part of a performance that said, "Nothing unusual here, just another day." Yet behind the lace curtain of the carriage window, she shifted uncomfortably, praying her disguise would hold. Even something as simple as shopping became a dance of concealment. In bustling markets, women maneuvered with practiced skill, baskets carried high, parasols tilted, friends positioned strategically at their sides. The very chaos of the marketplace could serve as cover, allowing a woman to slip through unnoticed if she moved with enough confidence. And don't forget the humor in all this. Imagine a woman so adept at arranging shawls and parasols that she looked like a walking fabric shop, layers piled on with improbable precision. Perhaps her friends joked privately that she could smuggle half the pantry under her skirts and no one would suspect a thing. In a world so strict, humor became both relief and rebellion. So, as you ride along that jolting carriage road in your imagination, parasol balanced just so, you realize how travel wasn't just movement, it was camouflage. Whether by carriage, train, or clever accessories, women transformed ordinary outings into acts of secrecy, carrying their burdens not only in silence, but also in style. You drift now into the parlor of a wealthy home, where velvet curtains pool on the floor and gilt-framed portraits line the walls. The fire in the marble hearth crackles, and the lady of the house sits primly on a carved chair, her silk gown flowing like a river of fabric. Wealth shaped the experience of pregnancy concealment in ways both subtle and striking, and class differences often determined just how much secrecy could be maintained or how quickly it unraveled. The mainstream fact is this: middle and upper-class women had far more resources to manage pregnancy in privacy. They could afford multiple gowns tailored to disguise changing figures, and they had servants to run errands, shielding them from public scrutiny. Wealth also bought them the luxury of retreat, travel to take the waters at a resort, or extended stays with relatives in the countryside, all perfectly respectable excuses that doubled as concealment strategies. Meanwhile, poorer women rarely had such options, often laboring visibly until late in pregnancy. Here's the quirky tidbit: some elite women commissioned specialized gowns with detachable panels or adjustable seams, designed to expand gradually while maintaining fashionable silhouettes. Imagine a 19th century version of maternity wear disguised as Paris couture. One London dressmaker even advertised garments for delicate conditions that could be worn before, during, and after pregnancy, an early stab at what we'd call capsule wardrobes. Of course, whether the seams really fooled society or just created new gossip is another matter, and here's the scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether wealthier women's concealment freed them from stigma or simply subjected them to a higher bar of scrutiny. Some scholars claim that privilege offered protection, insulating families from gossip. Others argue that prominent women were more tightly watched, with every absence, every wardrobe change, every missed social call noted by the public eye. It's an open question. Did money buy privacy, or did it amplify pressure? Picture the stark contrast: a farmer's wife in Ohio, her belly rounding beneath a faded calico dress, still trudging to the barn with a milk pail because no one else can. Neighbors notice, but they shrug. It is work, after all. Compare that with a merchant's wife in Boston who suddenly excuses herself from a string of soirees, claiming illness. Her absence doesn't go unnoticed. It sparks conversation over punch bowls, and speculation swirls faster than the ladle. Poverty made secrecy impractical, but wealth made it suspicious. Servants often played a key role in this balancing act. Maids ran errands to avoid their mistress being seen, footmen carried notes excusing absences, cooks and laundresses covered for unusual needs in the household. Yet servants also became the most dangerous leaks if they gossiped. Secrets spread quickly. Wealth brought layers of protection, but it also created layers of risk. And then there were the portraits and photographs. Wealthy families frequently commissioned likenesses to hang in parlours or exchange with relatives. Artists and photographers colluded in concealment, draping shawls or arranging furniture to obscure pregnant figures. Sometimes women were painted with carefully positioned hands, resting just so across the waistline, neither admitting nor denying the truth. It was artistry as camouflage, the brushstroke as veil. For poor women, there was no such luxury of discretion. A factory worker or washerwoman couldn't simply vanish from her duties. Her body told her story in public, whether she liked it or not. Pregnancy for her wasn't a secret. It was a visible reality that neighbors, co-workers, and employers noted, sometimes with pity, often with judgment. The contrast is almost cruel. Wealth could buy silence, poverty forced exposure. So as you settle into that gilded parlor in your imagination surrounded by velvet and lace, you understand that secrecy was never equal. For some, it was a game of clever concealment, parasols, gowns, retreats. For others, it was a battle already lost before it began, their bodies betraying them under the weight of labor and poverty. You move now into a different house entirely, not the velvet-curtained parlor of privilege, but the bare wooden cabin of an enslaved family in the American South. The walls are rough-hewn, the air heavy with humidity and smoke from a small fire. Here, the story of pregnancy concealment takes on a harsher edge, because for enslaved women, hiding a pregnancy was often impossible, and sometimes, tragically, it was punished. The mainstream fact here is this: enslaved women's pregnancies were not considered private matters at all. They were viewed by slaveholders as economic events, new property being added to the ledger. Slaveholders tracked menstrual cycles, forced examinations, and even calculated breeding potential. In such conditions, the idea of modest concealment, so fiercely practiced by free white women, was stripped away. A pregnant body was not her secret to manage. It was someone else's asset to exploit. Here's the quirky tidbit. Despite this surveillance, enslaved women sometimes tried to resist by concealing pregnancies in the earliest months. They might wear looser work dresses, adjust postures, or avoid drawing attention until it was impossible to hide. Some even used folk remedies, herbal teas, poultices, or charms to try to control fertility or delay visibility. In rare cases, women hid pregnancies from overseers long enough to protect their unborn children from being sold immediately after birth. It was secrecy as rebellion, a fragile act of defiance in a world determined to expose them. And here's the open scholarly debate. Historians disagree about how much autonomy enslaved women retained over their pregnancies. Some argue that they carved out pockets of resistance, maintaining cultural practices and community support networks that gave them some control. Others insist that surveillance and exploitation stripped nearly all privacy away, leaving only the barest room for secrecy. The truth likely lay in the shifting margins, moments of hidden strength within overwhelming oppression. Picture the scene. A woman working in the fields, hoeing rows of cotton under the sun. Her dress hangs loose, sweat dripping down her back. At first, no one notices the change in her gait, the way she pauses longer between strokes. She knows she cannot hide forever, but for a few weeks she moves carefully, hoping to shield herself from the master's calculation. Around her, other women quietly notice and silently adjust the rhythm of work, covering for her where they can. It's an unspoken solidarity, born of shared survival. And yet, for many, concealment was futile. Slaveholders often prized high fertility, expecting women to bear child after child, regardless of their health. Pregnancies were not only visible, they were demanded. A swelling belly was not scandal, but profit, a sign of increased wealth for the owner. Imagine the cruel inversion, what free women hid for fear of shame. Enslaved women were forced to display as evidence of their value. Still within enslaved communities, there were private spaces of acknowledgement. Women shared herbs, advice, and rituals away from white eyes. Songs carried coded references to pregnancy and motherhood. Even if the larger society refused them secrecy, they crafted their own forms of protection and meaning. These acts, though small, were powerful. They turned pregnancy from a transaction back into something human, even if only in whispered circles at night. The burden, however, was immense. Concealment became not just about modesty, but about survival, for the mother, for the child, for the fragile hope of family continuity under a system determined to break it apart. So as you stand in that imagined cabin, the fire crackling low and the night pressing close outside, you feel how different this form of concealment was. It wasn't about corsets, parasols, or shawls. It was about life and death, autonomy and resistance, the desperate attempt to shield something sacred in a world that refused to let it remain private. You leave behind the plantation cabin and step into a bustling port neighborhood where the air smells of coal smoke and salty sea breezes. This is the world of immigrants, Irish, German, Italian, Chinese, each group carrying its own traditions and anxieties into the crowded tenements and row houses of 19th century America. Here, pregnancy concealment looked different again, shaped by old-world customs colliding with new-world scrutiny. The mainstream fact is this: immigrant women often lived in cramped, multi-family dwellings where privacy was almost impossible. Tenement walls were thin, kitchens and outhouses shared, and neighbors quick to notice any change in figure or absence from work. Yet these women carried with them traditions from their homelands, rituals, remedies, and superstitions surrounding pregnancy that sometimes emphasized secrecy even more strongly than American norms. For example, many Irish families believed that speaking openly of pregnancy could invite bad luck or the evil eye. Silence became both cultural inheritance and practical protection. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some German immigrant communities in Pennsylvania encouraged pregnant women to wear small charms or amulets, pieces of ribbon, coins, or even religious medals tucked under their clothes, not just for health, but to ward off gossip. These talismans worked like secret armor, invisible to the eye but powerful in the mind. Imagine a woman at market haggling over cabbage, her neighbors none the wiser that beneath her apron she carried both a child and a lucky charm. And here's the open scholarly debate. Historians disagree about whether immigrant women assimilated quickly into American codes of modesty or whether they clung to their homeland traditions. Some argue that by the second generation, families largely mirrored mainstream practices of euphemism and concealment. Others suggest that cultural enclaves preserved older ways of secrecy, mixing superstition with silence. The evidence is patchy, drawn from scattered diaries and oral histories, leaving us with a mosaic more than a clear picture. Imagine an Italian immigrant mother in New York's Five Points, her hair pinned up hastily as she carries laundry through crowded streets. She avoids eye contact, her shawl pulled tightly around her belly, because gossip in such a dense neighborhood spreads like wildfire. Across town, a German woman takes to her bed under the excuse of a lingering illness, while her neighbors quietly nod in recognition of the code. Meanwhile, Chinese women in San Francisco's Chinatown may disappear from public view entirely, hidden within close-knit family courtyards until after birth. For immigrant families, concealment also tied into survival economics. A visibly pregnant laundress or seamstress might lose her job, and with it, the family's rent money. Silence wasn't just about respectability, it was about keeping food on the table. Neighbors, too, were strategic, sometimes choosing to ignore what they plainly saw, knowing their own turn at secrecy might come soon. There were also moments of collision, immigrant customs clashing with American expectations. A German or Irish woman who laughed off superstitions about the evil eye might scandalize her American neighbors by speaking too casually about her condition. Conversely, an American neighbor might find it strange when an immigrant family all but vanished from social life for months, chalking it up to foreign ways. Each group judged the other, yet they all shared the same core instinct, to guard pregnancy from too much light. So as you walk those crowded immigrant streets in your imagination, children darting between carts, vendors shouting prices, laundry strung across alleys, you realize concealment was a language spoken across cultures. Sometimes it sounded like silence, sometimes like superstition, sometimes like careful excuses. Each community folded pregnancy into its own fabric of fears and traditions, but the result was strikingly familiar. Women carrying both new life and old secrets, wrapped together in shawls, charms, and whispered codes. You wander now into the heart of a small town, where gossip isn't just idle chatter, it's currency, entertainment, and sometimes a weapon sharper than any blade. The wooden sidewalks creak underfoot, and the sound of screen doors slamming punctuates the air. Neighbors linger on porches, exchanging pleasantries that quickly slide into whispers. In 19th century America, gossip was one of the most powerful forces shaping how pregnancies were concealed or exposed. The mainstream fact is this: communities, especially rural ones, were small enough that everyone knew each other's business. Absences from church, loosened corsets, or even fainting spells at the market could spark speculation. Gossip often determined whether a pregnancy remained a private family matter or became public scandal. Once whispers spread, they could travel astonishingly fast, sometimes faster than letters delivered by post. Now, for the quirky tidbit, some towns had unofficial gossip hubs: the milliner's shop, the post office, or even the pump where women fetched water. These spots functioned like 19th century social media feeds where information was exchanged and amplified. A single remark at the pump in the morning could be halfway across town by afternoon. You might say gossip had better engagement rates than anything printed in the local paper. And here's the open scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether gossip was primarily destructive or whether it sometimes protected women. Some suggest that once rumors spread, they ensured a community kept watch, ready to help when labor began. Others argue that gossip ruined lives, branding women as indecent long before facts were known. It's a tricky balance. Was gossip a safety net of collective knowledge or a trapdoor of shame? Picture it. Two women bent over a washtub in the backyard, skirts tucked up, soap suds flying. One leans in conspiratorially. "Did you see how Mrs. Whitfield held her shawl yesterday?" The other nods, eyebrows arched, both chuckling softly. By evening, that private observation has multiplied into an entire storyline, complete with invented details. A raised eyebrow here, a sigh there, and suddenly the whole town knows. For unmarried women, gossip could be devastating. A mere hint of pregnancy was enough to scare off suitors, fracture friendships, and isolate families. Even married women weren't safe. Gossip about too many children too quickly or suspicious timing could taint a family's standing. Sometimes the whispers weren't even about pregnancy itself, but about whether a woman might be hiding one. In a culture where silence ruled, speculation filled the void. And yet gossip wasn't always malicious. At times, it was a way of signaling quiet support. Neighbors might drop by with extra food or gently steer conversation away from a woman's condition, protecting her from harsher tongues. A knowing glance, a carefully timed change of subject, these were the small kindnesses hidden within the same networks that spread suspicion. Still, the risk outweighed the relief. Once a rumour took root, it was nearly impossible to uproot. Families sometimes went to great lengths to control the narrative, planting counter-gossip of illness or travel, hoping to divert attention. It rarely worked for long. People craved stories, and a hidden belly was the juiciest story of all. So as you lean against the fence of that small-town street in your imagination, you hear the hum of voices, laughter mixing with whispers, truth blending with invention. Gossip wasn't just background noise, it was a force of nature, shaping who remained hidden, who was exposed, and how women carried their secrets beneath layers of fabric and silence. You step now into the dim glow of a parlour lamp, where a husband lounges in his armchair, pipe smoke curling upward, while his wife sits across the room, embroidering in silence. He looks at her fondly, perhaps even with pride, but notice what's missing. Acknowledgement. In 19th century America, men were often the last to openly recognize what was obvious, the swelling curve of pregnancy. Male ignorance, whether genuine or carefully performed, played its own peculiar role in the culture of concealment. The mainstream fact here is this: Victorian and antebellum etiquette discouraged men from speaking of pregnancy directly, even to their wives. Fathers-to-be were expected to maintain a kind of dignified blindness until the child was born. A gentleman might gush over his newborn, but to comment on the wife's condition beforehand risked being seen as crass. Many husbands preferred to act as if nothing had changed, even when their wives were clearly struggling with fatigue or nausea. Now for the quirky tidbit. Some men wrote in their diaries about being surprised when their wives went into labour, as though a baby had fallen from the sky overnight. In one case, a merchant described the birth of his 7th child as unexpected news from the lying-in chamber, which either shows an almost comical level of denial or an extreme commitment to propriety. Imagine living in the same house and pretending not to notice the most obvious transformation happening across the dinner table. And here's the open scholarly debate. Historians disagree about whether male ignorance was genuine or simply performative. Did husbands truly fail to notice, or did they deliberately look away to preserve the social fiction of modesty? Some argue men sincerely lacked awareness, given how little women discussed their conditions. Others believe men noticed, but chose silence, participating in a cultural conspiracy of not seeing. The answer, as always, probably shifts case by case. Picture the dinner table. The wife passes bread with a steady smile, hiding her wince as the baby kicks. The husband thanks her, oblivious or pretending to be. Conversation turns to crops, business, politics, anything but the unspoken truth in the room. Servants clear the dishes, careful not to glance too long at the mistress. Everyone knows, yet no one says. The silence thickens like gravy on the table. Male ignorance wasn't only in the home. In public, men often brushed off rumours or questions about their wives. A neighbour might hint, "Your lady seems in delicate health," to which a husband would reply with vague lines about her constitution or the weather not agreeing with her. It was a dance of denial, maintaining dignity while keeping the secret intact. Of course, some men did know and chose to help, arranging travel, shielding wives from demanding visitors, or running errands themselves, but even then they rarely named the reality. It was one thing to act in protection, another to break the taboo of words. Pregnancy existed as a silent fact, acted upon but never admitted. And there's humour here too. Imagine a husband genuinely baffled, chalking up his wife's sudden exhaustion to an excess of embroidery, or her fainting spells to poor digestion. He writes to a friend, "She grows rounder, but we think it is the pudding." You almost want to shake him and say, "Buddy, it's not the pudding." So as you watch that lamplit parlor fade into the smoky haze of a husband's pipe, you realize how silence stretched across genders too. Women concealed, neighbors whispered, and men played the part of oblivious spectators. Whether through ignorance or pretense, their silence stitched another seam in the great fabric of concealment that wrapped pregnancy in shadows. You wander now into the glossy pages of fashion plates, those carefully engraved illustrations that fluttered out of magazines like Godey's Lady's Book or Peterson's magazine. On each page, women pose in graceful gowns, their waists impossibly narrow, their skirts sweeping out like bells, their posture statuesque. These images weren't just about selling fabric, they set the standard for what respectable femininity looked like. And if you're looking for a rounded belly, you won't find it here. Fashion plates effectively erased pregnant bodies from public imagination. The mainstream fact is this: fashion illustrations consistently portrayed women with idealized proportions regardless of what real bodies looked like. They celebrated tiny waists, smooth silhouettes, and upright posture, creating an aspirational standard that left no room for pregnancy. By presenting this image month after month, the plates reinforced the idea that proper women did not appear visibly expectant in public. If a woman's body diverged from the illustrations, it became her task to conceal it until she could return to that narrow-waisted ideal. Now for the quirky tidbit. Some illustrators, pressed by readers or editors, quietly modified fashion plates to suggest gowns that could accommodate matrons. The changes were subtle: slightly looser waistlines, higher sashes, or more elaborate drapery around the midsection. But even then, the women were drawn as serenely slim, their figures hinting at possibility, but never declaring it. It's as if pregnancy was allowed to haunt the margins of fashion, but never to stand in the spotlight. And here's the scholarly debate. Historians disagree about whether women actually believed these plates represented achievable bodies, or whether they recognized them as fantasy. Some argue women internalized the images, lacing themselves tighter to match the illustrations. Others suggest women treated them as aspirational art, a decorative fantasy rather than a prescription. The truth is, likely both. Some strained to embody the impossible, while others simply nodded, tore out the page, and tucked it into a scrapbook. Picture the impact: a young wife flipping through a fresh issue of Godey's, the scent of ink still sharp. She admires a gown described as suitable for afternoon calls, noting the flounces and ribbon trim. She knows her own body is changing, but here on the page, no such body exists. She feels the gap between illustration and reality, and she adjusts her shawl just a little tighter, determined to close that gap in her own mirror. For seamstresses and dressmakers, fashion plates became both inspiration and challenge. Clients might bring them an engraving and ask for something similar, leaving the seamstress to quietly add hidden seams or adjustments to accommodate swelling figures. The dress outwardly matched the plate, but inside it was altered, a secret collaboration between needle and necessity. And humor crept in here too. Some women joked about fashion plates being drawn by men who had never seen a real woman. "If I had that waist," one diary quipped, "I'd fold in two like a pocket knife." Yet the images still carried weight. Jokes softened the pressure, but didn't erase it. The erasure of pregnancy from fashion plates also shaped photographs as the century progressed. Early daguerreotypes and cartes de visite imitated the poses of engraved illustrations, positioning women carefully to obscure bellies. The photograph, like the plate, became another stage for concealment. So, as you flip through those glossy engraved pages in your imagination, you realize fashion wasn't just about fabric. It was a cultural script, instructing women on how to be seen or not seen. The smooth lines and narrow waists told a quiet story. If you are pregnant, you must disappear, at least in public, until your body once again resembles the image on the page. You step now into a photography studio, the kind tucked above a busy street with tall windows that let in filtered light. The air smells faintly of chemicals, collodion, silver nitrate, and the photographer, with his stiff collar and careful moustache, arranges sitters against painted backdrops. In the age when photography was still a novelty, families flocked to have their likeness captured. Yet here, too, pregnancy remained a ghost in the frame, hidden in plain sight. The mainstream fact is this: portraits of pregnant women were extraordinarily rare in 19th century America. Photographers, like painters before them, colluded with clients to obscure the reality. Women posed seated, shawls folded neatly across their laps, or stood at angles that minimized their bellies. If a pregnancy was too obvious, the woman often didn't sit for a portrait at all, waiting until after birth to reappear in family albums with the child in arms. Photographs documented families, not the process of becoming them. Now, for the quirky tidbit, some photographers employed clever tricks to help conceal. Furniture was a favorite prop. A strategically placed chair, table, or even a decorative urn could hide the midsection. Curtains were draped not just for aesthetics, but for camouflage. There are surviving photographs where you can sense the artifice. A woman leaning heavily against a pedestal, her shawl arranged just so, the composition screaming "nothing to see here," while her body quietly told the opposite story. It's the 19th century version of holding a giant tote bag in front of your stomach for group photos. And here's the scholarly debate. Historians disagree about whether the absence of pregnant portraits reflected women's own preferences or photographers' cultural biases. Did women avoid the camera because they internalized shame, or did photographers steer them away, considering pregnancy unfit for display? Some argue it was a bit of both, a shared understanding that images should capture the ideal, not the inconvenient. Whatever the cause, the result was silence. An entire stage of life vanished from the visual record. Picture a young couple climbing the narrow stairs to a studio, the wife's gloved hand resting lightly on the banister. She is already in her 7th month, her body heavier, her movements slower. Yet in the finished photograph she appears graceful and composed, seated in a high-backed chair with a lace shawl artfully arranged. To the casual eye, it's a portrait of a woman in repose. To those who knew her, it's also a photograph of concealment, an image staged to preserve modesty. In painted portraits, the same tricks applied. Artists often positioned women with baskets, books, or children already in their arms, the swelling belly tucked behind drapery or shadow. The few surviving images of openly pregnant women from the 19th century stand out precisely because they break the rule. They look almost rebellious, as if the sitter insisted on being captured honestly. But such honesty was rare. Family albums, too, carried the silence. You might flip through a set of cartes de visite and notice a gap, months where a woman simply isn't pictured. Then, suddenly, she reappears, baby in arms, her body returned to acceptable shape. It's as though life paused, skipped a frame, and resumed only once the scandalous in-between had passed. Even post-mortem photography, the haunting practice of capturing images of the dead, erased pregnancy. Infants were photographed lovingly, swaddled in lace, sometimes posed with siblings. Mothers, however, were rarely pictured if they had died in childbirth, unless the body was disguised to look restful, the condition itself unmentioned. The silence was maintained even beyond life. So, as you stand in that studio in your imagination, the photographer fussing with his tripod, the smell of chemicals in the air, you understand that concealment extended beyond words and fabrics. It seeped into images themselves, shaping the visual history of the century. Pregnancy was lived daily, but rarely preserved. And in those vanished bellies, hidden behind shawls, tables and shadows, you glimpse the great paradox, the most ordinary fact of life, edited out of the record. You wander now into the bustling world of the 19th century marketplace, not the one with apples and cloth bolts, but the noisy, booming marketplace of miracle cures and patent medicines. Colourful posters flap in the wind, painted bottles gleam in shop windows, and travelling salesmen stand on wagons, shouting promises about secret formulas guaranteed to restore female health or regulate delicate cycles. Everyone knew what these phrases meant, even if no one said the word outright. Pregnancy was being managed, hidden, or even erased through the medical marketplace. The mainstream fact is this: by the mid-1800s, patent medicines were among the most aggressively marketed products in America, and many of them targeted women's reproductive lives. Remedies labeled for female irregularities or obstructed menses were often coded ads for abortifacients, or, at the very least, treatments to mask or delay signs of pregnancy. Newspapers carried the ads openly, couched in euphemisms, while society winked and pretended not to notice. It was concealment commodified, bottled, branded, and sold for a few cents a dose. Now, for the quirky tidbit, some of these medicines contained ingredients that sound more like witches' brews than respectable products. Pennyroyal, tansy, ergot, and even turpentine found their way into tonics and pills. Others were laced with massive amounts of alcohol or opium, which at least made the taker feel something, even if it wasn't what was promised. One advertisement bragged that its formula would invigorate the female constitution, while almost certainly knocking the drinker unconscious for several hours. Imagine calling that a cure. And here's the scholarly debate. Historians still argue about how effective these medicines really were. Some likely induced miscarriages, often at great risk to women's health. Others probably did nothing at all except intoxicate or sedate. Were women buying them out of genuine belief or out of desperation for any tool to maintain secrecy? Some scholars argue that advertising exploited fear and modesty, preying on women's silence. Others suggest women were savvy consumers, using the marketplace to carve out small spaces of control in a society that otherwise denied them autonomy. Picture a young woman slipping into an apothecary, bonnet drawn low, voice barely above a whisper. She asks for a bottle of Dr. Strong's Female Renovator. The shopkeeper doesn't blink. He knows what she means. The bottle slides into her basket beside flour and candles, indistinguishable from ordinary purchases. She carries it home hidden beneath her shawl, a small glass vessel of both hope and hazard. In travelling shows, medicine hawkers used carnival flair to cloak their real business. They promised cures for weak constitutions and nervous afflictions, but their leaflets often contained a wink and a nod toward women in peculiar states. Crowds cheered, coins clinked, and another round of secrecy was sold under the guise of entertainment. At the same time, religious leaders thundered against these remedies, calling them sinful and unnatural. Doctors, too, publicly condemned them, though some quietly prescribed similar concoctions in their private practices. It was a double game: condemn in daylight, collude in shadows. The hypocrisy only added to the fog of secrecy around pregnancy, and the humour, dark though it was, seeped in as well. Imagine a woman quipping to a friend, "I'm just taking a little tonic to regulate my nerves," both of them laughing at the shared code. It was gallows humour, a way to cope with the risks of swallowing mystery liquids in the name of secrecy. So as you stand amid the clamour of that medicine market in your imagination, you see bottles clinking, posters promising miracles, women walking away with carefully guarded purchases. Pregnancy concealment was no longer just a family strategy or a social performance. It was a commercial transaction, a booming business built on silence, shame, and the desperate desire to keep certain truths hidden at all costs. You step now into the quiet world of novels and parlour reading, where stories flowed across pages but rarely said the most obvious words. Imagine a family gathered around a lamp, the father reading aloud from Dickens or Hawthorne, children listening wide-eyed. The heroine might fall mysteriously ill, withdraw from society, or be described as confined. Yet the text never dared to mention what readers already guessed. In 19th century literature, pregnancy lived in the shadows, hinted at but almost never named. The mainstream fact is this: novels and short stories of the time largely avoided explicit references to pregnancy. When characters did bear children, their pregnancies were skipped over or shrouded in euphemism. Terms like delicate health, in her condition, or withdrawn from company, stood in for the reality. Even when childbirth shaped the plot, say, an heir's arrival or a mother's death, the months leading up to it were erased, leaving a blank space in the narrative. Writers bowed to the same cultural modesty that silenced conversation in parlours and pulpits. Here's the quirky tidbit. A few daring authors dropped sly hints that pushed the boundaries. In one serialized story, a heroine was said to have laid aside her corsets for a season, which was as close to saying pregnant as print dared to go. Readers understood perfectly well, but the phrasing allowed editors to keep their reputations intact. It was a literary game of charades, where everyone guessed the answer without anyone saying it aloud. And here's the scholarly debate. Critics still argue whether this silence reflected censorship by publishers or internalized cultural norms among writers. Did authors cut mentions of pregnancy to avoid scandal, or did they genuinely consider it unfit for public storytelling? Some scholars suggest women, writers in particular, longed to be more honest, but knew bluntness would jeopardize their work's acceptance. Others argue that even readers preferred the vagueness, finding it improper to dwell on such subjects. The truth, as usual, may straddle both, self-censorship reinforced by societal demand. Picture a popular serialized novel in a ladies' magazine. The heroine disappears midway with a brief note: she retired from society due to her delicate condition. Months later, she reappears, now the mother of a healthy infant. The story continues as though nothing has happened in between. For readers, it was both a wink and a nod. Everyone knew, but no one asked. The silence itself became part of the ritual of reading. This avoidance even shaped how children's books and moral tales presented family life. Mothers were often portrayed as endlessly nurturing, surrounded by offspring, but the messy reality of how those offspring arrived was skipped entirely. A mother might fall suddenly ill one day and then, as if by magic, be pictured cradling a newborn. Stories raised generations of children to see family as a fait accompli, the process hidden behind curtained words. And yet there were exceptions, whispers of rebellion. Some reformist writers began to criticize the silence, weaving in more open references to childbirth and women's struggles. These were usually cloaked in moral lessons, urging readers to show compassion rather than judgment. But even these progressive voices tread lightly, never spelling out the blunt reality. Humor crept in as well. Satirical magazines sometimes poked fun at the cultural dance, with cartoons showing women vanishing mysteriously from social scenes, only to reappear with infants in tow. The joke was clear. Everyone knew what was happening, but society pretended otherwise. So, as you turn the crackling pages of a 19th century novel in your imagination, you feel the weight of all that wasn't said. Pregnancy became literature's invisible character, present, essential, but always in the wings. The hush of the parlour extended into print, ensuring that even in fiction, women's most transformative experiences remained concealed, wrapped in euphemism and silence. You drift now into the halls of politics and reform meetings where men in dark coats debate tariffs, railroads and suffrage, their voices echoing against plaster walls. Newspapers record every speech, pamphlets fly across towns, and yet, in all this noise, one subject is conspicuously absent. Pregnancy, so central to daily life, was almost entirely invisible in political discourse. Even as questions of women's rights began to stir, the reality of reproduction was quietly skirted around, as though naming it might unravel the whole public fabric. The mainstream fact is this: 19th century debates about women's rights, education, property ownership, even suffrage, rarely address pregnancy or childbirth directly. Reformers like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony spoke boldly about equality, but often couched their arguments in terms of morality, virtue, and motherhood as ideals, not as embodied realities. Politicians, meanwhile, avoided the subject entirely, treating pregnancy as too private or too improper to be part of civic conversation. Here's the quirky tidbit. One satirical cartoon from the mid-1800s depicted women in bloomers marching for suffrage while balancing cradles and knitting. The joke, of course, was that politics and reproduction didn't mix. Yet the cartoon never dared show an actual pregnant body. Even satire, which thrived on exaggeration, refused to breach the cultural taboo. Pregnancy was rendered invisible even in mockery. And here's the scholarly debate. Historians disagree on whether the silence around pregnancy in political discourse was strategic or accidental. Did reformers deliberately avoid it, knowing society wasn't ready for frank talk, or did they themselves internalize the taboo so deeply they never thought to bring it up? Some argue that open discussion might have derailed early feminist arguments, while others suggest that avoiding it limited the movement's long-term reach. Either way, pregnancy remained the unspoken cornerstone of women's lives, never directly addressed in political halls. Picture a town hall meeting in a small New England village. Men gather at the front. Some women in bonnets sit politely in the back, listening. A reformist woman rises to speak, her voice steady, as she argues for women's right to manage property or gain higher education. She gestures gracefully, careful to frame her argument in terms of abstract justice and Christian duty. Now imagine she is 5 months pregnant, though no one mentions it, and she herself never names it. The shawl covers, the words glide past, and the most obvious truth in the room remains invisible. Even laws concerning reproduction dodged the language. Bastardy statutes addressed illegitimacy, inheritance, and paternity disputes, but rarely used plain terms for pregnancy or childbirth. Legal codes treated the body as an abstraction, a vessel for social categories, never a subject in itself. It was another layer of erasure, silence written into law. For women navigating political activism, this silence was a double bind. On one hand, invisibility allowed them to step into public roles without constant reference to their bodies. On the other, it reinforced the idea that their embodied experiences, pregnancy, childbirth, motherhood, were separate from politics, confined to the private sphere. Even reformers often emphasized motherhood as a moral ideal rather than a physical reality. And yet in private correspondence, some activists spoke more openly. Letters between women reveal frank discussions of exhaustion, miscarriages, and the difficulty of balancing activism with childbearing. These private words rarely made it into print, but they remind us that even reformers lived within the same silences that governed every household. So, as you picture the crowded halls of reform in your imagination, speeches booming, pamphlets fluttering, you notice the quiet absence louder than the noise. Pregnancy was the great unspoken backdrop to every debate, shaping women's lives while remaining officially unsayable. It was politics by omission, a silence that spoke volumes about what society dared not name. You find yourself in a house at twilight, shutters closed tight, the whole place unnervingly quiet. Upstairs, in a small chamber, a woman grips the bedpost as waves of pain roll through her. The midwife wipes her brow, whispers reassurances, and shoos the family out into the hall. Outside, Children pressed their ears against the door, listening to muffled cries while neighbors walked past on the street, unaware of the storm inside. This was childbirth in 19th century America, kept firmly behind closed doors, as secretive as the pregnancy that led to it. The mainstream fact is this: labor and delivery were considered private, almost taboo events. While everyone in the household knew it was happening, the sounds and sights of childbirth were carefully contained within lying-in rooms. Visitors were kept away, men were often barred entirely, and even younger daughters might be told only vaguely what was occurring. Birth wasn't celebrated with open fanfare, but cloaked in silence until the baby was safely delivered and both mother and child could be presented to society. Now for the quirky tidbit. Many families hung special curtains or blankets over bedroom doors during labor, both to dampen sound and to signal privacy. In some places, neighbors pretended not to notice when the midwife's carriage arrived, as if the whole event were invisible. One diary mentions that a town blacksmith hammered louder than usual during a neighbor's labor, supposedly to cover the cries. Imagine coordinating noise camouflage just so the street wouldn't hear what everyone already suspected. And here's the open scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether this hush surrounding childbirth was purely about modesty or whether it also protected women from interference. Some claim the silence reinforced shame, keeping female pain hidden from the public eye. Others suggest it gave women rare spaces of female-centered authority, where midwives and mothers-in-law managed events without male intrusion. Was the lying-in chamber a prison of silence or a sanctuary of women's power? Scholars still wrestle with the answer. Picture the moment of announcement. After hours or days of seclusion, the midwife finally opens the door, face weary but smiling. She whispers the news to the waiting family, and only then does the household exhale. Bells are not rung, announcements not made immediately. Instead, the event unfolds like a secret, reluctantly shared. Neighbors may not know until the baby is christened, or until a swaddled bundle appears in church weeks later. Even the language reinforced concealment. Women weren't described as giving birth, but as being confined or brought to bed. The process was erased, replaced by polite abstractions. Mothers themselves often downplayed their experiences in letters, writing only that they had been indisposed, but were now recovering. Pain and risk, both immense, were folded into euphemism, their reality invisible to outsiders. And yet, within those closed rooms, bonds were forged. Female relatives gathered, midwives guided with skill, and mothers drew strength from the presence of women who understood. It was one of the few times when women's experiences dominated the household entirely, even if only in whispers. So, as you stand outside that closed chamber door in your imagination, listening to muffled cries fade into silence, you realize how childbirth continued the same pattern as pregnancy itself, hidden, softened, and carefully managed to protect reputations and propriety. The arrival of new life was momentous, but it was staged as a private drama, its reality veiled until society deemed it fit for daylight. You step softly into the weeks after childbirth, when the baby's cries echo faintly through the house, but the mother herself seems to have vanished. In 19th century America, postpartum life was often lived in near seclusion. Women disappeared from parlors, churches, and marketplaces, retreating behind doors until they were judged fit to re-emerge. If pregnancy was hidden, the weeks that followed were just as carefully veiled, as though society wanted to pretend the messy in-between never happened. The mainstream fact is this: many women followed a tradition called lying in, a postpartum period of rest that could last 4 to 6 weeks. During this time, mothers stayed mostly indoors, cared for by female relatives or hired help, gradually regaining strength before resuming public life. Doctors often recommended seclusion, citing both health and modesty. Only once a woman was churched, a religious rite of thanksgiving and purification, was she considered fully restored to society. Now for the quirky tidbit. Some families took lying in to theatrical extremes. Curtains were drawn, visitors turned away, and meals delivered upstairs so the mother would not be seen. Diaries record women joking about feeling like ghosts haunting their own homes. One wrote that she had become an unseen house spirit, fluttering between nursery and bedchamber, but never allowed in the dining room. It's as if mothers were temporarily reclassified as household furniture, present but invisible. And here's the scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether this postpartum seclusion was empowering or oppressive. Some say it offered women a rare chance to rest, shielded from duties and gossip. Others insist it reinforced shame, forcing mothers into hiding until their bodies were deemed respectable again. Was lying in a sanctuary of healing or a cage of silence? The answer perhaps depends on whose diary you read. Picture a young mother peering through lace curtains as carriages rattle by outside. She longs to join her neighbours at church, but tradition keeps her indoors. Her husband entertains guests in the parlour below, while she rocks the infant upstairs, listening to muffled laughter through the floorboards. She is both at the heart of the family and cut off from it. Her absence is noticed, but explained away with vague phrases. She is resting, she is confined, she is not yet presentable. When women finally did re-emerge, it was often staged carefully. The churching ceremony, still practiced in some Protestant and Catholic communities, marked her return. Neighbours greeted her with polite congratulations, but the unspoken rule was that the details of her confinement stayed hidden. What mattered was that she appeared composed, waist cinched again, child in tow. Society skipped straight from secrecy to presentation, as though the pain, exhaustion, and blood of childbirth had never happened. And humour crept in, as it always did. Some women teased one another about re-entering society newly hatched, or joked about needing a reintroduction to their own neighbours. But even the laughter reinforced the strange ritual. Mothers had to vanish, then reappear as if reborn themselves. So, as you walk those hushed corridors in your imagination, hearing only the creak of floorboards and the faint whimper of an infant, you realize that concealment did not end with birth. It extended through the postpartum weeks, erasing not only pregnancy but also recovery. Women returned to the world only when the script allowed, curtains drawn back, shawls neatly draped, and silence once again covering what had truly passed behind closed doors. You move now into the later years of the century, when the iron grip of silence began, ever so slightly, to loosen. The lamps are brighter, the railroads louder, and the world itself seems to hum with change. Medicine advances, cities expand, and social attitudes, though still steeped in modesty, start to shift. The concealment of pregnancy doesn't vanish, but by the 1880s and 1890s cracks appear in the old facade. The mainstream fact is this: by the late 19th century, obstetrics was becoming more professionalized. Male physicians increasingly replaced midwives in middle-class households, and medical journals began to describe pregnancy and childbirth in somewhat more clinical terms. Euphemism lingered, but scientific detail crept in. Terms like gestation and uterine development slowly entered print, hinting that society was, at last, ready to speak more openly, though always in the cold tones of science, never the warm tones of daily life. Now, for the quirky tidbit, department stores began selling maternity clothing by the end of the century, though often tucked away discreetly or advertised under coded names like adaptable dresses. These garments allowed for discreet adjustments without announcing their purpose. It's almost comical. Maternity fashion existed, but you practically needed a secret handshake to find it. The very racks were hidden in plain sight, much like the bellies they were meant to disguise. And here's the scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether these late-century changes reflected genuine social acceptance of pregnancy or simply new forms of control. Some see the rise of medical authority and maternity products as progress, acknowledging women's realities at last. Others argue it replaced one kind of silence with another, medicalizing the body and turning natural processes into conditions to be managed by men in white coats. Was it liberation, or just a shift in who controlled the narrative? Picture a middle-class woman in the 1890s browsing a department store in a bustling city. She pauses near a rack of dresses with hidden seams, the clerk lowering his voice as he offers special accommodations for ladies. She nods, blushing, and selects a gown that looks fashionable enough to wear to tea while quietly expanding at the waist. In her shopping bag lies not only fabric, but also a fragment of changing culture, the faint acknowledgement that pregnancy could be managed in public, not just hidden at home. At the same time, popular literature began to include more honest depictions. Reformist magazines wrote cautiously about maternal health, offering advice on diet, exercise, and hygiene. The tone was still hushed, but the door cracked open. Women could at last find printed words that spoke to their actual experiences, though often couched in medical or moral lectures. And humour poked its way in too. Satirical papers occasionally joked about the ever-growing demands of the stork, a metaphor so thinly veiled it practically shouted what people refused to say. It was progress by inches, laughter prying open what solemnity kept shut. Still, the culture of concealment remained strong. Many women continued to withdraw from society as their pregnancies advanced, and gossip didn't lose its sting. The old codes, delicate condition, indisposed, confined, remained in circulation. But in the faint glimmers of change, in department stores, medical texts, and satirical cartoons, you can see society beginning to adjust its lens. So as you walk into the twilight of the century in your imagination, street lamps flickering to life along crowded avenues, you sense both continuity and change. Pregnancy was still cloaked, still whispered about, but the cloak was thinning, the whispers softening. The silence was beginning at last to crack. You step now into a lecture hall filled with the rising voices of reformers, women in stiff dresses and men with ink-stained fingers, pamphlets rustling in their hands. It is the closing decades of the 19th century, and early feminism is gathering steam. The air buzzes with debates about suffrage, property rights, education, and temperance. And within that hum, you begin to hear something startling. A few voices daring cautiously to question the great silence around pregnancy. The mainstream fact is this: reformers like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucy Stone, and other women's rights advocates began to link motherhood with politics, arguing that women's roles in bearing and raising children gave them a unique stake in civic life. While still avoiding blunt language, some spoke more openly about the burdens of repeated pregnancies and the lack of support for mothers. For the first time in American public discourse, the secrecy was being nudged, if not shattered. Now for the quirky tidbit. Stanton once wrote scathingly about the double life expected of women, paraded as moral guardians while silenced about the very realities of reproduction. In private letters, she even joked about the absurdity of pretending that babies drop down chimneys like so many parcels. Her wit sliced through the cultural hush, though she often softened her tone in public speeches to avoid scandal. And here's the scholarly debate. Historians disagree about how far early feminists pushed the issue. Some argue that their critiques of pregnancy silence were bold, planting seeds for later reproductive rights movements. Others believe they only brushed the surface, still too cautious to address pregnancy frankly in mixed company. Was early feminism a true rupture with concealment, or merely a subtle shift wrapped in the same euphemisms. The evidence, drawn from speeches, pamphlets, and private letters, leaves room for debate. Picture the scene: a reform convention in a packed hall. The speaker, a woman with fire in her eyes, rails against the exhaustion of constant childbearing and the hypocrisy of a society that reveres mothers but hides their struggles. The audience murmurs, some nodding, others shifting uncomfortably. A newspaper reporter in the back scratches notes, already deciding which lines to publish and which to omit. The speech will appear in print, stripped of its sharpest words, the cultural silence editing even the reformers themselves. In temperance circles, too, pregnancy crept in sideways. Women argued that drunken husbands endangered wives and unborn children, framing maternal health as a reason to curb alcohol. They still cloaked it in euphemism, but the mere mention of expectant mothers in public campaigns marked a shift. Silence was no longer absolute, it was fraying at the edges. Of course, laughter found its way in here as well. Some reformers joked privately that men were simply uncomfortable with the topic because they preferred to imagine their children delivered by storks in frock coats. The humour softened the sharp edge, making it easier to nudge open a forbidden door. Still, the risk was real. Women who spoke too openly could be labelled indelicate, their arguments dismissed as immodest. Many reformers walked a careful line, balancing honesty with strategic restraint. The result was a kind of half-rebellion, cracks in the silence, but no full break. So, as you sit among those rustling pamphlets and fiery voices in your imagination, you feel the stirrings of change. Pregnancy was still concealed, but now the concealment itself was being questioned, if only in cautious tones. The silence had begun to tremble under the weight of words, and though the century ended with many veils intact, the first hands were reaching to pull them aside. You arrive now at the century's end, the gaslights flickering along crowded boulevards, the hum of carriages blending with the clang of streetcars. The city feels modern, brimming with motion, yet the shadows of the past linger. Pregnancy, still wrapped in euphemism and modesty, has been reshaped but not erased. The echoes of concealment in 19th century America did not simply vanish with the turning of a calendar page. They seeped forward, shaping how bodies, modesty, and privacy would be understood for generations. The mainstream fact is this: even as medicine professionalized, feminism stirred, and department stores discreetly sold maternity dresses, the cultural expectation of silence remained strong. Respectable women were still urged to hide their condition until the very last moment, then reappear with baby in arms as though nothing had happened in between. The script of concealment endured even as its props changed. Now for the quirky tidbit. Advertisements at the dawn of the 20th century often featured storks carrying babies, but not a whisper about mothers themselves. The bird became a convenient mascot, a stand-in for all the realities no one wanted to name. Children were told fairy tales of storks, cabbages, or angels delivering infants, while adults exchanged the same old euphemisms, in a delicate state, confined, indisposed. The entire culture seemed determined to outsource honesty to a bird in a top hat. And here's the scholarly debate. Historians still wrestle with the legacy of this silence. Some argue it entrenched shame, laying groundwork for modern body anxieties and the medicalization of childbirth in the 20th century. Others suggest it preserved modesty and privacy in a world that otherwise left women little control. Was it repression, protection, or both? The conversation remains unsettled, much like the women who lived under its weight. Picture the modern echoes, advertisements for diet pills, the persistence of euphemisms like expecting, the polished photographs of celebrities whose pregnancies seem to appear only when staged for a glossy magazine cover. Even today, the idea that women must manage the visibility of their bodies, control it, shape it, reveal it on someone else's terms, carries traces of the 19th century hush. And yet there is also resilience. Beneath the silence, women built their own networks of trust, humour, and survival. They whispered remedies, shared shawls, disguised absences, and invented codes. They carved spaces of solidarity where society offered none. Their secrecy was not just repression, it was also creativity, a way of reclaiming some control in a culture that constantly tried to take it away. So, as the gaslights dim and the city's hum softens in your imagination, you recognize the enduring paradox. Women hid their pregnancies not because they were unimportant, but because they were so profoundly important that society wrapped them in silence as though protecting, or perhaps imprisoning them, in shadow. And now let the story itself fade, just as those women once did, into the quiet of their parlours. The streets grow still, the last carriage wheels fading into the distance, the curtains drawn across every window. The voices hush, and so must we. Take a slow breath now and let the weight of these stories settle gently. You've walked through parlours and kitchens, through carriages and churches, through spaces where whispers carried more power than shouts. You've seen women tuck secrets beneath shawls, lace them into corsets, slip them into coded words and bottles of bitters. And you've watched them disappear behind doors, only to re-emerge with infants in arms, as though entire chapters of their lives had been lived off stage. As you drift toward rest, imagine those quiet rooms again, not as prisons, but as sanctuaries of stillness. Picture lamplight glimmering softly against lace curtains, the hush of footsteps in a hallway, the low murmur of voices speaking in confidence. These were the spaces where women found strength, where silence became its own kind of shield. Let the rhythm of the past soften into background hum. The gossip, the sermons, the corsets, the photographs, all of it grows faint, like echoes in another room. What remains is the steady beat of resilience, the quiet truth that life continued, always, no matter how tightly society tried to bind it. Breathe deeply, as if you're stepping into one of those parlours, the air faint with lavender and wood smoke. Feel the heaviness of the day slide off your shoulders, replaced by the gentle weight of blankets. Let your body rest as theirs did in lying in rooms, shielded from the noise outside. And as you sink deeper, imagine the silence not as concealment, but as comfort, like a curtain drawn, softening the world so you can finally close your eyes. History quiets now, and so do you. Drift slowly and steadily into the hush of sleep.